In this video, we're going to take a look at the critical features of effective use of graphic organizers, and we'll be looking at 3 dimensions. And then I'm going to share with you some specific things to look for during walkthroughs so you can get a sense of whether teachers are implementing the Make Sense strategies effectively or not. So effective instruction using graphic organizers is really, there are 3 critical dimensions that are going to make it or break it in terms of how well they're going to actually impact student outcomes. The first is the actual graphic organizer itself and the information on it. And for an example, you can have a terrific graphic organizer designed really well, but pretty lousy information on it. Likewise, you can have great information, but if the graphic organizer you're using is the wrong one or poorly designed and so forth, then that's going to be a problem. Second main idea we're going to look at is the quality of graphic organizer instruction. So we're not talking about the device, we're talking about how teachers use the device when teaching. And finally, the other critical dimension of this is sustained applications, which basically means using them on an ongoing basis. So in terms of the quality of the graphic organizer device and the information on it, first of all, what's really critical is they're developmentally appropriate. In other words, graphic organizers that are really good for 3rd graders may not be really good for 9th graders. And so we want to have a match between the graphic organizer and the sophistication of the learner, and rather than using the same type of graphic for all kids. Another key thing is the graphic organizers themselves have what we call discipline-specific prompts. In other words, there are prompts embedded onto the graphic that cue students how to think about the information in different ways and so forth. And you've seen a number of examples of how that looks. Another key thing about the information on the graphic organizer is the information on it needs to reflect really critical, essential to know information. In other words, what's on the graphic needs to be stuff that you really expect kids to learn and remember. And finally, the way that information is communicated on the graphic needs to be in bullets, not paragraphs. One thing we often see with sort of novice users of graphic organizers is they try to compose whole paragraphs and then try to fit them into the text boxes. And if they won't fit, then they reduce the size of the font. And if it still won't fit, they reduce it even further until you get down to font sizes like 4 or 5 where you really need a magnifying glass to read it. Well, that dog don't hunt, okay? The key thing is to condense it down to the minimum words to get it down to a bullet that captures the essence of the idea, not everything about the idea. In terms of the quality of graphic organizer instruction, these can be used before or at the beginning of a lesson when you're introducing information and so forth, as well as at the end of the lesson when you're reviewing it. Likewise, during the lesson, there's several key things to be focusing on. One is called scaffolded instruction, or also called gradual release, where the teacher is modeling how to use the technique, doing it with students, and then facilitating correct practice of it, and eventually leading to independent use of the graphic. Another key during type of set of instructional procedures are what we call maximum engagement strategies. In other words, there are things teachers can do with graphic organizers that really get kids involved and engaged in the material. Likewise, what's really important is that teachers are not just passing these out as handouts without any really mediation in how to use them and feedback on them and that sort of thing. In terms of sustained application, some big ideas here is that they're used not just in one teacher's classroom, but across the curriculum. Basically, the more teachers are using the graphic organizers across the curriculum, the bigger the impact those devices are going to have on students' both knowledge and literacy skills. In terms of how often they should be used, if I could wave my magic wand, they'd be used at every lesson 3 or 4 times, but obviously that's not realistic. But a realistic goal is that they be used at least twice weekly in varied applications. So they're not using the same graphic the same way every time. Likewise, what's another critical point is that the graphic organizers themselves are evaluated and graded. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So the bottom line is the once and done use of graphic organizers is going to have minimal impact. It's really not going to make any difference at all. The applications need to be sustained. So what? What's important to understand about this? All three areas are really critical. So in terms of walkthroughs, and you're going in and you're observing teachers and to get a sense of how well they're doing in using these resources. There are three major categories to look at when you're doing a walkthrough. One is evidence of sustained graphic organizer use. Another is evidence that the value of the graphic organizers is routinely communicated both by the teacher and by students. And the third area is evidence of effective graphic organizer instruction. And so what I'm going to do next is sort of unpack each of these and give you an idea of some specific kinds of evidences to look for during Make Sense walkthroughs. So for an example, under evidence of sustained graphic organizer use, one of the things we want to look for are student and permanent products, and that they reflect that the students are using a range of different graphic organizers in their products. And so some of the graphic organizers are used for different purposes. I mean, the same graphic organizer. So for an example, they may use, hypothetically, let's say a three main idea frame. And so one purpose is to use that for a reading comprehension type assignment. A different purpose would be to use that to plan writing of an essay. Another purpose might be to use that when making a presentation about a topic and so forth. So the same basic graphic organizer is being used in a lot of different ways. If you see that happening, that's evidence of really good graphic organizer use. But at the same time that's happening, we're also looking for a range of other graphic organizers that are also being used. So it's a little bit of both what we're looking for. And so graphic organizers are used for a range of purposes is really critical. And so, for an example, before the lesson, some different ways that teachers might use that graphic organizer at the beginning of a lesson are things like reviewing or pre-teaching vocabulary at the very beginning of content area lessons. Another good time to use them at the beginning of the lesson is when you're reviewing prior learning at the beginning of the lesson. Another way of using it is pre-assessing to find out what students already know about the upcoming topic. And they're also really powerful tools for providing students with an advanced organizer that overviews key ideas of a forthcoming lesson. Now, there are a lot of different ways to use this at the beginning of the lesson. A teacher really won't have time to use all of these different applications in the same lesson. But hopefully you will see from time to time that they do use the graphics at the beginning of the lesson to target any of these. Now, these are all very solidly research-based practices. Likewise, during the lesson, there's some key things to look for. Probably the most important, well, not the most important, but these are several things to look for. One is guided note-taking, using the graphic organizers during direct explanation of subject matter. So for an example, when a science teacher is explaining a science concept or a process and so forth, they're using a graphic organizer and doing guided note-taking on it as they're explaining the information. Another great time to do it during a lesson is guided reading versus via graphic organizers as the text is analyzed. Likewise, when using a range of some of the high engagement routines like priority share, which is having students go back and prioritize the various main ideas in terms of which were the most important to least important, or the most interesting to least interesting, or anything that gets them prioritizing the information and then arguing about what was the most and what was the least and that sort of thing. Jigsaw reading routine is a really powerful thing to do with graphic organizers, as is pair share and the what so what routine and the pause procedure or buddy checks. And so these are just examples of various high engagement routines that lend themselves really strongly to the use of graphic organizers. And so when you're seeing teachers do things like jigsaw reading, and you see them also using a graphic organizer to support the use of jigsaw reading, you know good stuff is going on in the classroom. Some ways of using it after a lesson include reviewing new vocabulary, using graphic organizers, reviewing the lesson's main ideas and essential details, what so what, reflective reviews, There are a range of others, but that just gives you an idea of some of the ways. Likewise, when you look at student assignments, examples include independent reading assignments where students, instead of answering study guide questions, are actually developing a graphic organizer that reflects the information from the text. Planning and producing essays or other written products where they're using the graphic organizers to plan and organize their ideas. When organizing and synthesizing information when researching projects. Likewise, when making presentations and so forth. So we want to look at the graphic organizers being used for a range of purposes like before, during, and after instruction, and also on different kinds of assignments that students have. Another thing to look for when you're doing a walkthrough is how well teachers can actually use the software itself. So for example, some key skills related to using the software is that teachers knowledgeable about the range of resources that are found in the toolkit, and they can readily navigate the software and locate those resources. That's a really critical skill. Likewise, they can import pictures into Smartsheets, which is a pretty easy thing to do, but it's a powerful thing. Perhaps most important is that they're able to select the Smartsheets from the software that are appropriate for addressing specific standards. In other words, they can read a standard and say, I need X and X type of graphic, and they can go find it on the software fairly quickly. Likewise, as I've mentioned repeatedly earlier, they're using bullets to identify essential information, and the two operative words there are bullets and essential information. Likewise, it's a good skill if they can import the digital Smartsheets into PowerPoint and then use them in their PowerPoint presentations. And finally, they're able to use the available classroom technology like smartboards or LCD projectors and so forth if it's available, and they know how to use the smart visuals in conjunction with using that technology. In terms of using the software, students using the software, we really encourage teachers to teach students to use the software as well. So for an example, one of the things we like to see is that the students themselves are knowledgeable about the range of resources on the software, and they can navigate it and locate those resources themselves. Because eventually we want to get to the point, instead of prescribing specific graphic organizers for students to use for a project, we want to be able to give them a project and have them figure out what would be a good graphic organizer for this project. Likewise, we like to see full use of the interactive nature of the digital Smartsheets by using them via computers to complete assignments. In other words, it's one thing to print out a bunch of blackline masters of the Smartsheets and have students write on them and so forth, but in today's world, they really need to be using the technology to complete those assignments. And so it is quite possible to use all of the resources in the Make Sense toolkit and have it be paperless. So in terms of evidence of sustained use and value is routinely communicated, I want to talk a little bit about the value thing, okay? So one of the key points under communicating the value of graphic organizers is use of the graphic organizers is celebrated on an ongoing basis. And what I mean by that are, if you go into the classroom and you see public displays of the students' graphic organizers on bulletin boards or taped to walls or doors or whatnot, that's sending a message that I really value how well you're using these graphic organizers. And so that's an example of celebrating its use. Likewise, if the teacher conducts periodic discussions that focus on essential questions associated with using a graphic organizer. Questions like, why are they used so much in my class? In what ways is this particular graphic useful or not useful? What's the hardest part of using this? What's the easiest part? What's the most important part? Things of that nature. Another question is, how do graphic organizers help you learn? How do they help you be more successful as a learner? What are some different situations or places where you might use this particular graphic organizer? What are some different classes where you can use it in, and so forth? And so, for an example, I've been in a number of teachers' classrooms where on Fridays, one of the things they do is they put the curriculum aside and they focus more on the learning tools that are being used in association with the curriculum. And the teachers are posing essential questions like these. Some teachers will do it on hump day in the middle of the week, like on a Wednesday. The key thing is that if students don't come to value the tools, they're not likely to use them on their own, and ultimately that's the kind of literacy we're going for. In terms of evidence of effective graphic organizer instruction, there's specific things to look for there, okay? Probably the most important is the use of gradual release or scaffolded assistance. And so anytime a teacher is introducing a new graphic that students may not be familiar with, it's really important to go through this sort of gradual release procedure. It's called I do it, we do it, y'all do it, and you do it, okay? I can say y'all because I'm from Alabama, okay? If you want to say you all, then if that floats your boat, that's fine. Anyway, when teachers are first introducing a new graphic, the teacher models, does a lot of modeling of how to use it and thinking out loud. And then it gradually shifts to the teacher and the class doing it together. It's sort of a we do it, where the teacher is guiding students' responses, but is in pretty much control of what's going to be noted on the graphic. That gradually shifts over to what I call y'all do it kinds of activities where peers are supporting each other as they're practicing using the graphics. And that's where a lot of those student engagement type tactics come in. And eventually that should lead to you do it, where students have independent assignments where they're expected to be able to use the graphic by themselves without assistance. The opposite of that is just giving them a black line master of a graphic organizer as an assignment, telling them to go do it without providing any kind of any real instruction on how to use it and things of that nature. Okay. So the key point here is that students are provided the independent graphic organizer assignments only after this guided assistance has been provided. Another bullet under effective GO instruction is that students are provided different types of graphic organizers assignments. Sometimes they do it as an assignment for reading, sometimes for assignment for writing, sometimes to use when they're doing research on the internet, etc. And finally, and this may surprise you, but the teachers are using the graphic organizers as assessment tools. And an example of that is many content teachers have essay test questions. And what they will do is accompany the essay test question with a blank graphic organizer that students are expected to use to formulate and organize their ideas before they actually write the answer to the essay question. Even better, the teacher will provide prompts on the graphic organizer in terms of cueing the student about specific subtopics that they need to think about when they're formulating the response to their essay question. Likewise, you can look at what a student has noted on a graphic organizer and often tell a lot more what they understand or misunderstand about key ideas you've been teaching by analyzing the information on the graphic. And that often reveals a lot more about their understanding than any true false or multiple choice question or traditional kinds of objective test questions ever will. Another key thing here is that students' ability to construct and use the graphic organizer is treated as an instructional objective. This is really important. In other words, we're saying that learning how to use a graphic organizer is part of the curriculum that we expect students to learn. Now, the difference is a lot of teachers see graphic organizers as just as an activity to do when they're teaching this stuff. And this is way more than an activity. This is a fundamental literacy skill on how to use, summarize, and synthesize and organize information. And so it's important for the teacher to view students' ability to construct and use the graphics as part of the curriculum that they're teaching. So likewise, equally important is that students are understanding the purpose of the graphic organizers and when to use them and how to use them. And that's also treated as an instructional objective. So for an example, if you're working with a history teacher, part of the instruction objective are obviously the history standards, but there are also content literacy standards that the history teachers are expected to be addressing, such as the ability to use graphic organizers and understanding their purpose and when to use them and how to use them and so forth. The implications of that are pretty huge. Because if graphic organizers, use and understanding of graphic organizers is part of the curriculum, that means that there needs to be an expectation communicated by the teacher of quality use to students, and that the teacher is providing really good explicit feedback to students on how well they're using the graphic organizers. Implications of that is that the quality of the graphic organizer produced by the student is a component of the grade that students receives. So thus, students are not graded just on how well they learn science, but they're also graded on how well they're learning how to use the literacy skills associated with the graphic organizer. And of course, graphic organizer rubrics are a really great way of integrating the grade into the content grade for doing that. So these are some of the critical features to look for in terms of how well teachers are using graphic organizers in their instruction. What we're going to be focusing on next are some very specific tactics and tools that you can use for supporting implementation. Now, obviously, walkthroughs is one of those tactics and tools, but it seemed to me better to put those back to back with looking at effective use. So we'll be looking at some additional tactic tools for supporting implementation in the next video.